Thank you, Alan, and good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I really want to thank Alan for coming up with the concept of doing the 12 steps. I mean, doing the book a chapter at a time over 13 months. So it's really, I think it's really an exciting project, and I've been looking forward to doing this. So anyhow, today we're going to do the first one. We're going to talk about the first two forewords, and I'm going to talk more about history than anything else. But since this is our first presentation in the series, we're going to have to cover some preliminaries and basic information today that's just not going to be repeated later. So that may slow us down a little bit on the history, but I think you'll get the picture. And we need to start off with information about me and who I am. So I've written this book called Writing the Big Book, The Creation of A.A. It basically covers the 18 months from the time they said, hey, in October 1937, hey, we should write a book. And 18 months later, they published the book. And that's the basic focus of that book. Now, when it came out, my wife, the lady Sarah, said, my God, it's the bigger book. It literally is bigger than the big book. And I just couldn't go. There was just too much information in the archive. I just couldn't drive by. So we ended up with a large book, folks. I began researching in September of 2007. I did my research at the General Service Offices archive in New York City at Stepping Stones. Brown University has the hugest Tremper's collection in the world. The Rockefeller Foundation in Sleepy Hollow, New York, and of course Akron, and a whole bunch of other places. And I researched right through the whole project. I'm still doing that. I'm still discovering stuff, and people are great at pointing out new stuff for me. I started writing on July 24th, 2010, and finished 7 years to the day later with the first draft. That was polished and edited for over a year, and the book was published on November 5th, 2019. So in short, my book is a scholarly study based on primary document research. And now you can find that out you can see that easily in the book because I've got 416 informational footnotes and 1,500 citational endnotes. So it's really, really an attempt to get a little bit closer to the story of what really happened. And today we're going to talk about what I discovered about what really happened in relation to these two forewords. So the first foreword, we have three different sources. We have three different sources for the first foreword. The multilith copy came out in mid-February of 1939. This is a copy, a photograph, I should say, of my particular copy. I own Jim Burwell's copy, and Jimmy had it rebound very elegantly. This is not the way it was when it was published, but the book was published on April 10th, 1939. But somewhere in the middle of February, around the 18th, 19th, or 20th, they made cheap copies of the book to show to people to see if they thought there was any problems with the book. Were there any errors in the book? They gave them to doctors and psychiatrists and priests and ministers and rabbis. They gave them to all the guys that were sober in Alcoholics Anonymous, asking for suggestions on things that should be changed before they actually took the thing to print. So the first source we have is on the forward is this mid-February 1938 multilith copy, and this is the copy I've got. It's in the upper left-hand corner. It says James L. Burwell. He was living at Hank Parkhurst's house. We'll hear about Hank in a minute, Montclair, New Jersey. Then he moved to San Diego. Anyhow, and this is kind of what it looked like. There was no Xerox machines in those days, so this was an offset printed process, and they made either 200, 300, or 400 copies of it. Nobody really knows for sure. I've been trying to find that out, but I haven't been able to find that out. And then the second version we have comes from the book Alcoholics Anonymous, the first edition printing, which was published in April 10th of 1939. And then we also have a version that came out in July of 1955 when the second edition was published. I believe the foreword to the first edition was likely the very last thing written before the printing of the multilith copy in mid-February of 1939. And by the way, a lot of people talk about that multilith copy as being the original manuscript for the book. So if you're doing some reading in AA history, those two things are those are synonymous things, the multilith copy and the original manuscript. They're talking about the same thing. One reason for the delay was that Bill Wilson was desperate to get some famous person to write a glowing endorsement of Alcoholics Anonymous as a foreword or as a preface to the big book. And his primary candidate for this was Henry Ford. Henry Ford was a hugely famous, they called him a super dry. He wasn't just a temperance guy, he was a super dry guy. And Bill just chased Henry Ford all over the place, left and right, for months and months and months before the book came out, trying to get him to write a foreword for this book. As late as March of 1939, just a month before the book was published, Bill traveled to Detroit to get an interview with Henry Ford, but he didn't get it. But he did get to manage to have a lunch with two of Ford's gatekeepers who'd been given the multilith copy. And but they were unimpressed, and they declined to pass it along to Henry Ford. So it just didn't happen. It didn't happen. But in February 1939, they finally print the multilith copy, and this is what the foreword looked like in the multilith copy. And there's some really interesting things in here. Really interesting things. I love it. We'll start with the very bottom of the page. This multilith volume has been sent upon request of $3.50, and the printed book will be mailed at no additional cost as soon as published. Now, there's this huge, I've heard this AA urban legend over and over throughout the years, that the book was so expensive that groups had to collect funds for several months just so they could afford to buy a single copy. Well, Bill said, we fixed the retail price of the book at $3.50, and this figure was the result of long and heated arguments. Some of the members had insisted on a $1 book. That would be Clarence out in Cleveland. Others wanted a $2.50 printing. They had turned deaf to Hank Parkhurst's pleas that we must make something on the deal, or else we could never operate a headquarters office, much less pay off the shareholders. Now, that comes straight out of Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age. Now, $3.50 was a bit expensive, but it wasn't completely out of line. Here's two books that were published very, very close to the publication of the big book. Gone with the Wind, which was published in June of 1936, and that cost $3. And Grapes of Wrath, which was published 2 days, I think, after the AA big book, and that cost $2.75. So $3.50 is a little expensive, but it's not out of line. So why are they going for the $3.50? Well, those books were both novels, and this book was priced higher because Hank and Bill considered it to be a textbook. He said, we looked up in the New York Times book reviews, and we priced textbooks in there. And we found that the cheapest textbook that you could get, this was to be no novel, of course, the cheapest, there was $3, and the most expensive one listed there was around $5. So $3.50 is a steal, right? That's the deal. The next thing I really want to note is here. This is the opening paragraph, and you want to note those capital letters, precisely how they have recovered, all in capital letters. And also, it says that there were, right at the very first line, there were 100 men and women. That's not. It's always a little bit contentious. Were there really 100 men and women? What was going on with that number? The biggest problem with that 100 number is that it was been liberally used from June of 1938 until April of 1939. They kept using this number of 100 people that they've gotten sober, as if there was no change whatsoever in the size of the fellowship during that entire 10-month period. In June of 1938, for instance, this is an example, June of 1938, way before April of 39. Today, this circle number is over 100 healthful, happy, and capable citizens. And then 100 men have been returned to society as useful members. Now, that was a proposed introduction of the book that was written in early June by Thomas Thatcher, Ebby Thatcher's brother, who was a very successful banker at the time. So Bill Wilson had obviously had him over for dinner or something, given him this pitch. He'd given him also a copy of the first 2 chapters. And that's where this whole idea, right off the bat, mid-June of 1938, they're talking about 100 people. Bill writes a to whom it may concern letter in late July of 39. And he says, during the past 4 years, approximately 100 men have recovered. And that this group of 100 men have apparently found the answer to the most baffling of human problems. And in February of 1939, when the multilith came out, there was only one woman in AA. Her name was Florence Rankin, and her story, A Feminine Victory, appeared in the first edition of the big book on page 217 and 225. So the problem with the 100 Men title for the book, and actually for the title, the original title for the corporation that was going to publish the book that they sold stock in late 1938 and early 1939, was a problem. It just completely ignored the fact that women also drank too much and women also needed to get sober. I would suggest that most especially in the beginning, the number 100 was used more as a marketing ploy than as an accurate count of sober alcoholics. They needed, Ruth Hawk accused Bill in a couple of her recorded talks of being a guy who liked to round numbers up. You need to round numbers up. So he was rounding numbers up pretty significantly. I think the most accurate count of sober alcoholics and early alcoholics and Alcoholics Anonymous would be the numbers given by Dr. Bob and Bill at a foundation board meeting on July 18th, 1939, January 18th, 1939. Again, this is just a month before the multilith comes out. And according to that, the minutes of that meeting, Dr. Bob said there was 75 in Akron, and Bill said there was 60 in New York, 135. That's probably an accurate number for early 1939, although they had a very liberal way of counting who was sober and who wasn't sober that a lot of people wouldn't agree with today, but that's another story completely. So February through April, they collect suggested changes for the multilith copy, and they write them down on one particular copy that's held in the Newark office of honored dealers. And Hank Parkhurst is writing these changes into them. His handwriting is all over this master copy that you could find if you, Hazelton published a facsimile of this thing called The Book That Started It All several years ago. It's a fascinating document for anyone who's interested in AA history. So here's what this looks like. All kinds of different changes going on here this is suggested changes to be made before we actually print the book. I love the fact that so they've changed. The book is going to show other alcoholics precisely how they can recover. We've now moved it to how we have recovered. This is the result of one of the big suggestions was you need to stop telling people what they have to do and tell them what you did. It needs to be suggestive. The text of the book needs to be suggestive rather than directive. And this is one of those changes that happened right there, right up front. So they can recover has now become we have recovered. And the whole bottom of the thing has a couple of interesting things on the bottom of this page for changes. He says, we shall try to contact such cases, but they've changed that. No, we're not going to. We should like to be helpful to such cases, because I think they realize that they might have more people than they could just contact if they got flooded with a lot of people. And on the right-hand side, Hank's written, we need to separate any notion of a pat on the back. Actually, the field needs workers, because they had said, you know, we should be interested to hear from anyone getting results from this book, particularly from those who have commenced work with other alcoholics. We will try to be helpful in such cases, but we need help with this deal. And then at the very bottom, there's a new P.O. box number they put in there. At the time, they were still Xing it out. It wasn't until 4 days before the book was published on April 6th that they actually had a P.O. box in New York City that people could send things to. So here's what the first edition printing of the book looks like. And you can see, again, we have on the left-hand side, we've got that precisely how we have recovered. And here, I'm sorry, I skipped right into the second edition printing here. Here's the changes. And it says, this is the forward as it appeared in the first printing of the first edition in 1939. Well, yeah. Except the capital letters, the big bold capital letters, have now been reduced to italics. And also, we've gotten rid of the information about the Alcoholic Foundation because that's been put in the back of the book now. So those are the three primary versions that we get to see of the forward. Now, there's a couple of really interesting things in here. Most especially, it's the main purpose of this book to show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered. It's interesting to me, at least, that there are three other mentions of purpose in the big book. They don't contradict this, but I think they supplement it. Bill writes, you may have already asked yourself why it is that all of us became so very ill from drinking. Doubtless you are curious to discover how and why. In the face of expert opinion to the contrary, we have recovered from a hopeless condition of mind and body. If you are an alcoholic who wants to get over it, you may already be asking, what do I have to do? Those are the three critical questions that show up, and there is a solution. And Bill says, it is the purpose of this book to answer such questions specifically. Those three questions. We're going to tell you how you got so very ill and what we did and what you have to do. And we agnostics, he says, well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object, its main purpose is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. And finally, interaction, he says, the real purpose is to fit ourselves to be a maximum service to God and the people around us. Okay, and I love this. Even in this early history of our program, some of the basic tenets of the 12 traditions have already been mentioned right here in the first forward. This is on February 1939, they're putting this thing out. I have to thank the late, great AA historian Art Sheehan for pointing these out to me, because I was oblivious to them as I can be with so much great stuff in the big book until somebody points it out to me. So in the forward, it says the only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. Note the honest. They took the honest out a while later, but our tradition theory says the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. The forward says we simply wish to be helpful to those who are affected. Tradition 5 says each group has but one primary purpose: to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. The forward says there are no fees or dues. Tradition 7 says every AA group ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions. Forward says we would like to clearly understood that our alcoholic work is an avocation only. Tradition 8 says Alcoholics Anonymous should remain forever non-professional, but our service centers may employ special workers. Forward says we are not an organization in the conventional sense of the word. Tradition 9 says AA as such ought never be organized, but we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. Forward says we are not allied with any particular faith, sect, or denomination, nor do we oppose any. Tradition 10 says Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues, hence the AA name ought never be drawn into public controversy. Forward says, when writing or speaking publicly about alcoholism, we urge each of our fellowship to omit his personal name, designating himself instead as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Very earnestly, we ask the press also to observe our request. Tradition 11 says our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need always maintain personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, and film. And it is important that we remain anonymous when writing or speaking. We just did this, a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Tradition 12, anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities. Which gives us a reasonable approximation of 8 of the 12 traditions in this, the earliest publication by Alcoholics Anonymous. I think that's really that's just, it's very cool. Okay, so let's move on to the second forward. I milked that first page for a bit there, so we got a few more pages to go here in the second forward. There were 16 printings of the first edition of the Big Book, printed between 1939 and 1954. The second edition came out in 1955, and it had a brand new forward, and it had many, many new stories in the back. They changed the stories in the back every time we have a new edition. They're actually looking for stories for the 5th edition at the moment. The second edition was released to coincide with the 1955 International Convention held in St. Louis, Missouri, where Bill Wilson officially handed over leadership of AA to its members. Handed over leadership of Alcoholics Anonymous to its members. And this is the resolution. Be it therefore resolved that the General Service Conference should become, as of this date, the guardian of the traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous, the perpetuators of the world services of our society, the voice of the group conscience of our entire fellowship, and the sole successors of its co-founders, Dr. Bob and Bill. Very, very, very important, important thing going on in Alcoholics Anonymous at this particular convention. Bill claimed that since AA was now 20 years old, 1955, it had finally come of age, and the pioneering time was over, and the new era of self-government was to begin. So what the second forward does is it presents a historical recap of the 20 years leading up to that momentous event. That's what was going on those pages when that thing was published in 1955. He was trying to give us a context for this handoff of leadership from Bill. Bob had died in 1950, from Bill to the General Service Conference. But the argument over how and when to talk about the group's history goes all the way back to June of 1938, when Bill first started to write the big book, and his right-hand man, Hank Parkhurst, was trying to convince him to open the book with a history of the movement. Oh, Hank who? Okay, this is another one of the sidebars. We're just going to do this once, folks. Who's Hank Parkhurst? Henry G. Parkhurst was Bill's right-hand man in New York City. Now, you may never heard of him, but after Bill Wilson, Hank is the most important person in early Alcoholics Anonymous history by far. Henry G. Parkhurst, I call him the forgotten co-founder. He's all but written out of the story because he drank again. The book came out in April of 1939. By August, Hank was drunk and he never got sober for any length of time after that. But it wasn't just that he would drink again. He started warring with Bill Wilson. He did not go gently into the night, as I say. But he's been so forgotten, so dismissed, so disregarded in Alcoholics Anonymous history that this guy doesn't even have a Wikipedia page, which I found shocking when I first started researching this book. And when I just go to Wikipedia for different things, I couldn't believe he didn't have a Wikipedia page. Wilson called him a super promoter. He was the greatest high-pressure salesman I've ever known. He said Hank was a terrific power driver and a hard-hitting salesman. Now, people talk about Wilson being a type A salesman kind of guy, you know. But if he was a type A guy, Hank Parkhurst was a triple A type guy. Jimmy Burwell, called him a high-pressure dynamo and described him as having an idea a minute. Hank was so central to the history of the writing of the big book that I can say without fear of contradiction, no Hank, no big book. Literally, folks. You got to read the whole book to get that picture and believe it. But believe me, it's right there in black and white, in my opinion. Early June 1938, he writes out Bill's writing. Bill's just written his story, his first draft of his story in late May of 1938. And now he's working on his first draft of There Is a Solution. And Hank's not happy with what's going on. So he writes an 11-page handwritten document of his ideas. And this is kind of what it looks like. This is the first page. And that's Hank's handwriting, and down at the bottom says Hank's idea. It says Bill Wilson's handwriting. So we don't have time to. This is a great document. But what Hank thought the very first chapter of the book should be about the history of the work. So chapter 1 is being dictated. Chapter 1 at the time was There Is a Solution. Bill's story was going to be chapter 2. But right away he says we need to have a history of this work, and the suggestions for chapter 1, a history of the work. Possibly this could be carried on the first 2 pages of the book. This history should establish proof of success of the work and carry hope to everyone that reads that much. The opening of the book should arouse the emotion of hope. Well, Bill, in 1938, Bill just ignored this advice. In 1939, early 39, late 1938, he finally gets around to writing Vision for You. There is the history of the movement in the last chapter of the book, not in the first chapter of the book. But in 55, he decides that this second forward would be the perfect place to present this history, as Hank Parkhurst said, which should establish a proof of success of the work and carry hope to everyone that reads that much. Now, Bill had written his first history of the group in the 1939 chapter of Vision for You, which basically recounts how AA came to Akron and then grew there. But that story of just 2 groups with 100 men and women sober using their suggested program of recovery paled beside the growth that had come after the big book was published. By 1955, Alcoholics Anonymous had mushroomed into nearly 6,000 groups whose membership is far above 150,000 recovered alcoholics. But before we go any further, another little sidebar, I really need to emphasize that Bill Wilson is not always a reliable source of facts about early AA history. We're going to stumble over this repeatedly as we go through the next 13 months. I don't want to just beat this to death, but it's important. This was a shocking thing to me when I first started doing research to find out some of these stories Bill Wilson told just weren't. He was a great storyteller, but he was a terrible, terrible, terrible historian. He took out the messy details. Now, let's face it, folks. I bet you your story told in an AA meeting when you're 5 years sober is radically different than when you were 6 months sober. You know, the messy details get dropped. And And it gets to be a much more spiritual story, I'm sure, also. But anyhow, Bill was a guy who left out the messy details. For instance, in late November of 34, he tells a story about Abby coming over and visiting. Well, let me tell you, Bill's version and Abby's version of that story are radically, radically different. And we're not going to get into that today. We'll get into that a couple of months from now when we get to Bill's story. But I want you to know that even this iconic, fantastically important two men sitting across the table, one alcoholic talking to another alcoholic story, is missing a lot of messy details that Abby tells us about. He also says, by the way, you got to remember when I tell you a different story that one of us was sober that night and one of us was drunk. Anyhow, no messy details. He also was a willful myth maker. Bill Wilson told myths and parables. He was trying to get people sober. He wasn't trying to be an accurate historian. And I'm not the only one saying this. Pass it on. Conference-approved literature, people, for people who think that's an important deal. He was never reluctant to stretch a fact for the sake of emphasis. No kidding. He often spoke in metaphor rather than relating events as they actually happened. No kidding. And he was never likely to pass up the opportunity to deliver a parable when he thought it could do some good. When he thought it could do some good. That's what Bill Wilson was trying to do. Good. He wasn't trying to write an accurate history or report an accurate history blow by blow of what happened in early AA. He was just deliberate self-deprecation. He was always sharing the wealth about things that he was solely responsible for. He would give to other people. It countered his own tendency towards grandiosity. It takes himself out of the spotlight. It tells a more inclusive story. Those are all good things. So he did that. He was always doing these self-deprecating stories. He left out a whole bunch of uncomfortable facts. There was things that he didn't really want to be talking about when he was talking about early AA history. The most prominent of these was he pointedly distanced AA from the Oxford group. There's really, a lot of things that could have gone into our book that would have been very, very Oxford group, or as Hank Parkhurst says in some of his notes, very groupy, but they didn't show up. So, and he didn't mention the Oxford group. The people in Ohio wanted him to very much mention the Oxford group in the book, and he didn't do that. Also, he makes scant mention of Hank Parkhurst when relating AA history stories. It's not an encouraging story to throw into your success story here about how we all got sober together, because this guy got drunk right after the book came out. And last, he's got a bad memory for dates. And just one example, Hank and Bill go to see the editor at Harper's on the first week of October 1938, and Harper makes him an offer, $1,500 down payment. They're going to publish the book, and Hank talks him into not doing that. But Bill always says, I know for a fact I've got letters, I can bookend it within 4 days that it happened in the first week of October 1938. But when Bill talked about it, he talked about it a lot. He stated that it happened in July, or probably in August, sometime around September 1st, late summer, early fall, and Lois says it happened on September 6th. So she's no more accurate than her husband is. Of course, most of the time she just parrots what Bill says. He rarely adds anything new to the equation as far as historical researchers go. But let me be clear, these criticisms of Bill Wilson's historical accuracy today and going forward in no way diminish his towering stature in the history of 20th century spirituality, or in any way compromises the truly remarkable things he accomplished during his lifetime. The fact that Bill elected to tell uncluttered and instructive stories and parables rather than historically accurate facts can hardly be held against him. Wilson was not a good Samaritan. He was a man of vision, an uplifting, grand, universal, deeply spiritual, a life-saving vision. Bill wasn't preaching salvation in the next world, though, with these parables and myths. He was preaching salvation in the world, here and now. That's what he was all about. Had he not done so, had he not told those parables or those myths or those stretches on the story, it's possible he would never have been successful in transforming his profound vision of widespread recovery into such a vibrant, spiritually enriching, international reality, something that he most certainly did before his death in January of 1971. Thank you, Bill, for telling those life-saving stories and parables. The story the story that Bill tells in the second forward is fairly accurate, but there are some departures from historical fact, and those are the things that intrigue and interest me. I always like to set the record straight. I'm a set the record straight kind of guy, you know. For instance, on the first page, Bill identifies himself as a New York stockbroker. That's what he calls himself. Bill Wilson never held a license to sell stock, never. He could more accurately be described as a stock speculator, or if you want to go gently into the night here a little bit, he was an entrepreneurial Wall Street analyst. Bill's primary job functions as a Wall Street entrepreneur were to, number one, identify a stock that was a good candidate for growth. He did a lot of great investigation on companies and what was going on with those companies, and it was kind of a new thing, this kind of stock analysis that he was doing, but he was really good at it. And then once he identified a company, he'd form a small group to buy significant shares of that stock. Then once they owned a bunch of the stock, they would sell others on the potential growth of this stock, thus increasing the price through greater demand. Supply and demand always works, raises the price. And then the original group would sell their stock at a profit. Wilson was, in fact, a sophisticated and astute analyst of undervalued stocks, and he was equally expert salesman when it came to convincing other investors to follow his lead and buy into the target company. That's what Bill Wilson did. So he calls himself a stockbroker, but he wasn't really that at all. Next, Bill credits the Oxford Group with making 5 important contributions to Alcoholics Anonymous. I find the Oxford Group was hugely important. It's the soil out of which Alcoholics Anonymous grew. There is absolutely no denying that, the Oxford Group. And Bill cites these 5 things as in the forward. 1, the need for moral inventory. 2, confession of personal defects. Number 3, restitution to those you had harmed. You got to be helpful to others, and a belief and a dependence on God. Now, we did owe tremendous things to the Oxford Group. And these 5 things are really important things. They fit right into the 12 steps of our program, our suggested program of recovery. But there's nothing really revolutionary about these 5 things. You know, these are kind of general spiritual things that were certainly floating around in the 1920s and 1930s in American Christianity, but also throughout the history of spiritual beliefs and pursuits throughout our human history. He also says, without any further explanation, that we could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford Group. Oh, that's interesting, really. We like those 5 things, but what were those things? In a 1940 letter, Bill noted 8 of these unacceptable tenets of the Oxford Group. 1, the aggressive evangelism of the group. They were pushy people, he thought. Number 2, their reliance on excessive personal publicity or prominence. No anonymity for these guys. No anonymity. They were looking for, and the more prominent a convert they could get, the better. They weren't looking to convert people off Skid Row. They were looking to convert people on Wall Street and in the big banking systems. 3, the unacceptability of the word absolute before the virtues of honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. The Oxford Group preached the absolute importance of absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love. Wilson says elsewhere that sent most of the drunks screaming out the door if you were asking them to be absolute on all of those 4 things just to stay sober. Number 4, the coercive nature of guidance for others and of the subsequent checking for those who had received that guidance to ensure that it was being followed. So you sit and you listen, you do a meditation practice and you get guidance directly from God. But what they frequently got was, I didn't get guidance from me, I got guidance for Al. And I needed to call Al up and say, you know, Guy, I just got some great guidance for you. And the guidance that people were getting for Bill Wilson was not making them happy. They wanted him to get a job, go out on Wall Street and convert some of those rich people, and he was wandering around the Bowery in New York. Anyhow, and then they would, after they gave you guidance, they would come back next week and say, so what'd you do with that guidance I gave you? Checking, they called it checking. Number 5, the practice of writing down guidance during quiet time, which was too often made ridiculous by novices scribbling messages from God in notebooks. I've done the Oxford group meditation practice a couple of times, and it's really, really interesting to sit and just write what comes to you. Write what comes to you, it really is. But I can also see Wilson's complaint here. Number 6, we found that the principles of tolerance and love had to be more emphasized in their actual practice than they were in the OG, the Oxford group, especially tolerance. So he said these people were talking a good game, but they weren't always playing a good game. Number 7, there could be no religious requirement for membership in AA. And number 8, the kind of dogmatism demanded by the group necessarily precluded Catholics from joining AA. Big stumbling block, big problem. So Wilson mentions in the second forward the 5 things that they did take from the Oxford group, very generalized, very important spiritual practices. But there's 8 things that they were doing that led AA to move away from the Oxford group and start forming their own belief system on what they needed to do to get sober. I just throw this in here just because I just really love the fact that we get these 2 versions of Dr. Bob's story of getting sober. Dr. Bob's nightmare. By the way, I'm just always surprised when I read Dr. Bob's story. You know, there's 11 pages of drunkalogue, and then there's 2 pages about him getting sober. You want to count the paragraphs? There's 31 pages of drunkalogue and 6 paragraphs on getting sober. And it's really, I need to know that people need to qualify and tell me that they've got the same kind of problem that I might have, but I'm more interested in the solution, and Dr. Bob's story is light on that. Many of the stories in the big book, especially the first printing of the first edition, are. So anyhow, Dr. Bob says, Bill shows up, but he had been cured by the very same means I have been trying to employ, that is to say, the spiritual approach. Bill had been working with the Oxford group people really, really hard trying to stop drinking, and he couldn't stop drinking. But so this guy shows up, and that guy's an Oxford group guy. He's been doing the same thing I've been doing. He's sober and I'm drinking all the time. What's going on here? Oh, he gave me information about the subject of alcoholism, which was undoubtedly helpful. This is the medical advice that Dr. Silkworth told him he needed to stick with that. So here's a quote unquote stockbroker from New York giving medical advice to a registered, to an MD. But far more important was the fact that he was the first living human with whom I had ever talked who knew what he was talking about in regard to alcoholism from actual experience. In other words, he talked my language. He knew all the answers, and certainly not because he had picked them up in his reading. That's Dr. Bob's version of what happened when Bill came. I had somebody tell me years ago that you listen to somebody's story in an AA meeting, you want to listen for the point where something happened. Something happened, and I didn't drink after that. And this is Dr. Bob's something happened moment. Bill's version is a little bit more concise, but it hits exactly the same points, and I love that. This physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means. He tried it, resolve his problem, but it had failed completely. But when the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never before been able to muster. How sweet is that? Little turning on a dime there almost. A willingness shows up that hadn't been there before. He sobered never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950. This seems to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. So I got to say again, Bill Wilson was a myth maker, and that means that the stories he told were not exactly correct. And one clear example of this comes from when he tells the story of A number 3 in this second forward. Bill Dotson's story is told in 4-part harmony in A Vision for You in the back of the book. 15 of the 57 paragraphs in that chapter, all about Bill and Bob going to see Bill Dotson and what happens and what they said to him and how it worked and all of that good stuff in the back of the book. But here in the forward of the second edition, it simply says, hence the 2 men set to work almost frantically upon alcoholics, arriving in the ward of the Akron City Hospital. Their very first case, a desperate one, recovered immediately and became A number 3. He never had another drink. Now, Bill Dotson may have been their very first hospital case. You could read that sentence that way, but Bill doesn't really make that distinction clear. But there'd already been at least 2 very well documented and spectacular failures with Dr. McKay And Bill mentions that in a letter to Lois and Eddie Riley, and it gets mentioned all over the place. So there was 2 failures before they got there. It wasn't the very first guy they worked with. So why is Bill playing so fast and loose with the facts here? What's going on? What good does this particular shaving of the story, getting rid of the messy details, does this parable serve? This very short story of AA number 3 encapsulates and clearly presents 3 of AA's core beliefs. This is brilliant writing, in my opinion, folks. You need to work with others if you want to stay sober. Sobriety can be passed on from one person to another person. And that sobriety can be permanent. It's not just a temporary fix. So I want you to look again at how brilliantly those 3 important messages, he's delivering a message here. He's delivering a message, a couple of messages, 3 messages are delivered in these 3 short and very dramatic sentences. Hence, the 2 men set to work upon alcoholics. You got to work with drunks. The very first case, he recovers immediately. You can pass it on. And he never drank again. Permanent recovery. Bang, bang, bang. That's great writing, Bill Wilson. Good job. But we always got to poke around in the archives or what other fruitful sources we can find and either confirm or deny the accuracy of the myths and parables that Bill so frequently told. At least I do. That's how I operate. For instance, Bill incorrectly claims that in 1937, a third AA group formed in Cleveland. I got no idea where this comes from. This is just Bill not paying attention to dates. It's another one of these date things. According to the best records we have, 2 people from Cleveland joined the Akron group in 1936, 3 more in 1937, and then 5 joined in 1938. The first one was Clarence, who turned out to be the ringleader and the big leader up in Cleveland. But those people were driving us 40 miles. They were driving from Cleveland down to Akron on Wednesday nights, coming to the meeting every Wednesday night, driving down, driving back. There was no group meeting in Cleveland until May 11th, 1939, a month after the book came out. So I don't know where Wilson got the 137. I can't believe somebody didn't pick up on it in the fact checker. He must have had fact checkers even in 1955 in AA. And Bill does a great job of summarizing the 12 traditions in this second forward. And he then notes that they had become so widely accepted by 1950 that they were confirmed at our first international conference held in Cleveland. This rather cavalier account fails to notice the hard work and sheer genius that went into the formulation of the traditions. I got to tell you, when I say sheer genius, the second time I read Ernie Kurtz's fabulous book, Not God, what blew me away was the brilliance of Bill Wilson writing those 12 traditions. I mean, the 12 steps were kind of pulled from spiritual stuff all over the place and packaged. They did a great packaging job on the 12 steps. That's a different story. But the 12 traditions just came out of all the people sending problems to New York and him coming up with solutions and ways to deal with those things. They're really, really brilliant. But there was a lot of treacherous politics for getting them approved. Clarence Snyder, who we just mentioned, and Henrietta Seiberling, the woman who introduced Dr. Bob to Bill, they had a little cabal. They formed a group. They tried to get the convention to vote them down. They were against any more rules in AA. We don't need any more rules in AA. We don't need any rules in AA, as a matter of fact. But anyhow, they did get approved. So he kind of skates by the how hard the work was to get to that point, and then Bill's lobbying for them, and then the treacherous politics surrounding them. Throughout, Bill clearly breaks down early A history into 2 separate and distinct groups. He calls the first one the Flying Blind period, 1934. He gets sober December 1934 to 1939, April. Big accomplishment was the writing and publication of the Big Book. Second is the pioneering time, which was also called the adolescent period, from 1940, right after the book came out, to 1955, when he does this big handoff. The big accomplishment of which were the creation and adoption of the 12 steps and the formation of the General Service Conference. I'd like to close with perhaps the most controversial statement to be found in the Big Book. Of alcoholics who come to AA and really tried, 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25% sobered up after some relapses. And among those remainder, those who stayed on with AA showed improvement. I can't tell you how often I've I've heard the arguments against this particular passage in the second foreword. It's interesting to me that these numbers go back much farther than Bill's writing them here in 1955. For starters, he always acknowledged that A didn't work for everybody. During 1936, he writes about the failure rate being immense. And similarly, in 1937, the percentage of failure was immense. And by mid-1938, they were so aware of their failure rate that Bill and Hank seriously considered including a chapter in the big book called The Chapter on Failures. But as they went through this flying blind period, before the big book, before we had 12 steps, this trial and error period, their success rate seemed to stabilize at 50% that Bill mentions in the second foreword. In an August letter, Bill writes that our experience tells us that just before or just after they have tossed the drunk onto the scrap heap, this is be the employer, we could set perhaps as high as 50% of those fellows back in the ring with a punch such as they had never had before. A few days later, he writes to Dr. Richardson, same thing. Much more than half of these men have never had any relapse whatsoever. A high degree of success with at least 2/3 of all the cases we have approached, 50% and 25%. And that's August, he's writing that. All too often today, we hear complaints that Alcoholics Anonymous just isn't as successful as it once was. I mean, who among us has seen anything like a 50% success rate for people who come through the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous? Indeed, not me. But let's look again at exactly what Bill wrote in this second foreword in 1955. Of Alcoholics Anonymous, of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried, 50% got sober at once and remained that way. So what do you think qualifies as having really tried after coming to AA? That's the criteria here for 50% of success. You got to come and really try. You think that's pit stopping at a couple of meetings? Or maybe getting your court card signed as many times as the judge told you I get it signed? Or adopting and acting on the don't drink and go to meetings mantra? I got to ask, when did don't drink and go to meetings become the program of Alcoholics Anonymous? I would like to suggest that to get your ticket firmly punched on the really tried requirement, any newcomer would have to regularly attend as many meetings as possible for a couple of months, get a sponsor, talk to them frequently, and then work all of the 12 steps with that sponsor. Personally, the newcomers I've seen over the years who actually did those simple things do in fact have an amazing chance of success of continued sobriety in Alcoholics Anonymous. Even better, I would say, than 50%. Really, even better than 50%. Go to a bunch of meetings, get yourself a sponsor, talk to them frequently, and work the 12 steps with that sponsor. But they got to really try. You got to get your ticket punched on those basics, or it doesn't work. Shocking, isn't it? Hank backs me up on this. Well, he wrote a Q&A chapter for the big book that got rejected. One of the questions is, what do you think of a newcomer's chance of recovery through this method? And he says, if he would follow strictly the experience of the rest of the men, you're going to recover. Follow strictly the experience of what we did. These are just a few of the interesting and important things to be found in the two forewords of our book. Taken together, those 9 pages present a wealth of sober inspiration for any alcoholic trying to get sober, but we have to take the time to look carefully and do some study in order to get the full benefit of what it actually says there. And what's true of those two forewords is even more true of the chapters that follow. It's a book well worth the time to learn the history and then to study and understand what it actually says on each page. Personally, I feel like more has been revealed every time I spend any serious time with our big book. So thank you. Oh, I just put a little quick thing in there. If you're interested in my book, my only pitch here, writingthebigbook.com. There's a little video for me. We got the table of contents. I've got a sample chapter, one of the more inflammatory ones, chapter 8. There is a solution, 7 reviews by gay historians, and then you can send me a message. Thank you.